draw. It sounds a little bit wonky, I suppose, but I took it from some readings that Catherine and I have been doing with some members of our neighborhood. We've initiated a discussion on race, and particularly race as a social construction. And so we're reading a lot of academic articles, watching a lot of videos about it. And one of the phrases that came up in this reading that have really, I think, sparked my thinking has been the phrase sociological imagination, or exercising our sociological imagination. And by way of explanation of why I think this is such a powerful idea, I want to begin, I suppose, the starting point for me and my entry point to this is like the opposite end of literally the opposite end of the galaxy from sociological imagination. I come from a background in astrophysics. And so my point of reference in terms of my academic background and I guess grounding in exploration of reality is stars and galaxies and, you know, and the cosmos writ large. And for the astrophysics community, and for the physics community at large, there's a sense that when we're exploring reality, we're exploring something which is totally objective. There's a ground truth out there that we're all in the process of getting at. And we have a method, you know, the scientific method of observation and forming hypotheses and testing those hypotheses and sharing the results of this with the community through articles and research notes and so forth. There's a sense that we can all agree on what the ground truth is. Because in the end, it all comes down to some version of reading a number off a dial. You know, is that dot, you know, on the photographic plate or not? And you put two people together and they'll agree, yes, the dial reads this or the dial reads that. So there's a sense, at least in the idealized case, that science is an enterprise in which it's possible to come to agreement as to what the ground truth is, what reality is. Of course, there's caveats. You know, science, like any other human endeavor, can be corrupted by money. It can be corrupted by individual ambition. Of course, it's possible for entire groups of research groups to go in a direction which is at odds with the results that another research group is going in. A perfect example in the cosmology community, which is this long-running debate which has been going on for decades, as to how fast is the universe really expanding. You know, and there's one group who have devoted their entire careers to following a particular research path, a particular mode of inquiry that leads them to the conclusion that the universe is expanding at a rate of something like 67 kilometers per second per megaparsec. And then there's a whole nother group that have devoted their careers to a different method of mode of inquiry that leads them to believe that the expansion of the universe is something like 73 kilometers per second per megaparsec. So there's, you know, and there's a whole lot of heat generated from this disagreement between these two groups. Is it 67 or is it 73? But that's kind of, I guess, a champagne problem in a sense, because if that's all, you know, if that's the sort of the depth of the disagreement, then still one can argue that there is, you know, behind the methods being used, at least there's a chance at getting closure, because as time moves on, you know, the numbers sort of inch closer and closer together. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is this view that truth is out there. It can be discovered. It may take a lot of iteration and a lot of work, but eventually everyone's going to agree that this is objective reality. And that way of thinking about the world seems, at least on the face of it, to be very radically different from the situation that we see when we move into the social sciences, particularly sociology, and that's why I want to talk about sociological imagination, because on the face of it, it seems like a complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of approach to reality. But I want to argue that there's potential ground for consonance in approach. The thing with sociology, and I'm not a sociologist, and I have no academic background in sociology at all. I've read a few articles. I thought a bit about it, and so that's as far as my expertise in the subject goes. And so I'm also speaking, a bit with I suppose with the bias of someone who's coming at it from a physics background, and physicists, I guess notoriously look down on anything that's not hard science. But trying to give it its due, it seems as though in the case of social sciences, when one is analyzing human societies and trying to come up with and trying to analyze it scientifically in the same way that you do with physics, the ground truths are very hard to come up with. It's very hard for everyone to come to agreement on what the ground truths of sociology are. The basic questions that are being asked are such that they seem to defy the kind of mathematical answers, the comforting mathematical answers that we get in physics. Some of the big questions, what does it mean to be a human being in a society? What is the true ground of human identity? What's the relationship between the individual and society? To what extent does one shape the other? To what extent should one shape the other? These are some of the fundamental questions of sociology, and one finds in the sociology community, there's no agreement on the fundamentals. And beyond that, there's no sense that there's a collective convergence on truth. It seems, at least more recently, that if anything, the examination of the world through sociological, it's becoming more and more fragmented in time. But what I want to suggest is a shift in perspective in looking at these sociological questions, and this is going to bring us into the position of the Baha'i faith on these sociological questions. I want to suggest a shift in perspective away from discussing what the ultimate ground truth is to taking a more pragmatic approach and talking instead about what works. And actually going back briefly to the case of physics, physicists like to believe that they're zeroing in on the truth, that they're zeroing in on reality, that when they write an equation and the equation works, that equation is reality. I think it's more correct to say that the work of science is a work of collectively converging on a better mathematical representation of reality, a better mathematical model of reality. And why we believe this is because it works. In the end, we believe that our scientific conclusions reflect reality because the equations work. They have predictive power in the world. So that because no one has access to ultimate reality, all we can say is, well, this set of equations allows us to make the following predictions, which everyone can agree come true. So ultimately, the standard of truth in science is a very pragmatic standard. Ultimately, one believes in something because it works. And then we would like to believe that if it works, then it must somehow be aligned with reality. We'd like to believe that being effective, being predictive is, in our minds, almost equivalent with being aligned with reality, being aligned with the ultimate truth of things. So what if we take that thought and apply it in the sociological domain? What if instead of asking what is the ultimate truth of human about the individual and society, what's the correct way of thinking about what's the correct theory, or what is the real ground of human identity and so forth? What if instead we ask what models help us? And those are the models that we focus on. So rather than talking about what the correct answers are, we take a pragmatic approach and talk about what remedies will lead to a tangible improvement in human well-being. So that, as I've argued, is ultimately what the hard sciences do. And I think I can argue that that's also the approach that Baha'u'llah suggests in one of his very central tablets, in his tablet to Monarchy Sahib, which has this very famous quotation that's in Gleanings. He says, "The all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require." So Baha'u'llah seems to be casting his revelation as, not as a, I don't want to create a false dichotomy and say it's not A but B, but Baha'u'llah is casting his revelation as a remedy, something which by implication should be judged on its efficacy. So if you apply this in the world, does it create a betterment in the world on the level of the individual, on the level of society? That way of thinking about things is, I think, creates a very subtle but important shift in the way we think about the ideas that form human society, because it takes us into a realm in which our thought becomes the reality. As Abdu'l-Baha says in Paris Talks, he says the reality of man is his thought, not his material body. And we have collectively, as a human race, as a human species, created our world very much out of thought. A great example of this is a great introduction to this idea about how our social reality is very much constructed by our own thinking, is given in the first chapter of Paul Lampo's Revelation and Social Reality. He has a great few pages in there which introduce the subject really well, and he himself quotes from the sociologist John Searle in discussing this. And one example he gives, which is I think a really great sort of a really great example, is the example of a restaurant. And this is, I think, an example that John Searle gives. He says that a simple visit to a restaurant has a reality that includes immediately visible objects, including the social meaning of money, a waiter, the restaurant, a chair, and invisible underlying aspects such as the concept of employment, an economic system, an agricultural system, and government regulations. There's also a normative dimension of social reality in that the waiter can be rude or polite, the food unsatisfying or delicious. The complex structure of social reality has layers and layers of meaning. Even language itself, the vehicle for the communication of these ideas, is a social construct. So you take something as, I don't know, obvious and physical as going to a restaurant and ordering a meal, something I wish we could do now. And every component of that is built upon a social construction. I mean, it's just amazing when you think about it. You could kind of sit there and let your mind be blown a little bit thinking about that. And one of the key takeaways that comes out of this is that if we've constructed this reality, if it's not a matter of the atoms themselves don't tell us, say, about the reality of money, that's that we pay the waiter when we leave the restaurant. That's something that it's invisible boundaries that exist in our mind, and the extent to which these various components of our everyday lived life are constructed by us empowers us to think about them in different ways, empowers us to think about how we might redefine those social constructions in other ways when they cease to be a remedy, when they cease to help us in some way improve our lives socially and individually. So, and it's a strange sort of dichotomy, because on the one hand, these structures that we're surrounded with, these structures of human imagination that we've built, in one way, they're not real at all. They're these invisible boundary lines that we choose to live within, and that we can choose, that we might think that we can choose to live without. But when we try to live without them, we realize that they actually are very real in another sense. So there's a kind of a tension between, on the one hand, it's very unreal. On the other hand, it's the most real thing that is a matter of life and death for many, many people. So another way this is stated in Revelation Social Reality, I'm looking around pages 8 and 9 here, is that the entire structure of social reality, it's taken for granted by individuals who are brought up in a culture that conveys social facts in the same way that it presents rocks or trees. So if our thought so shapes our reality, then this suggests a project moving forward, which is not a project of discovering or uncovering the sociological facts of the matter, but rather it's a project of selecting a more effective narrative, what Baha'u'llah would call a remedy, selecting a remedy that better matches the particular needs or illnesses of the age. And I wanted to talk about what a few aspects of that remedy are that involve exercising our sociological imagination, that involve taking what is given to us as though they were rocks and trees, and allowing us to redefine them, or in some cases, completely doing away with them. And I wanted to mention 3 or 4 things, and then have some concluding thoughts and then open up for discussion. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the concept of the nation. And I guess I'm going to be going in kind of ascending order from abstraction to concreteness, I guess. The idea of the nation is, as we can all imagine, something which is quite arbitrary. If one asks, where are the boundaries between nations? They are everywhere invisible. I mean, sometimes there may be a fence, more often there isn't, but there's fences all over the place. So land is demarcated, in various sorts of ways. But the demarcation of one chunk of land from another in our minds that creates the difference between one nation and another is something which exists in our sociological imaginations. And beyond that, not just the physical definition of a nation, but the people who comprise a nation, the people who identify themselves as being a member of this nation and not of that nation, is also a purely human construction, depending on the absolutely arbitrary fact of where you happen to drop into the world, on what patch of earth you happen to drop into the world when you were born. That in a very weird way, when you step outside and look at it, has absolutely a stunning amount of influence on the future course of our life. An arbitrary fact of you landed on this side of the border instead of that side of the border is so completely determinative of the kinds of possibilities you're going to have in your life. The idea of the nation, of course, is an extension of the concept of the tribe. And one author I would mention in this, which is very helpful in describing these sorts of sociological constructions and very brilliantly, is Yuval Harari, who wrote a few years ago a book called Sapiens, which is a big bestseller. And in the first part of Sapiens, he talks about how basically it required this collective act of, I don't think he uses the phrase, but this collective act of sociological imagination to basically bridge this evolutionary gap between human existence as it was in prehistoric times, where we all live just on a tribal level, to our existence now, where we're all aggregated into these large groups, tribal groupings, racial groupings, national groupings. We're all identifying ourselves as being a member of this or that group, sometimes several groups at the same time. And as Harari points out, that it required this like leap of imagination. And he suggests that this might have happened around 100,000 years ago. And one of the biggest leaps forward in our collective evolution was the ability to think abstractly, the ability to identify people who weren't in our personal social circles, who weren't family members or people who sat around the same campfire, to identify those people as somehow being part of us and not them. The ability to, in other words, to identify people as being a member of your tribe, which might be more than 150 people. Maybe it's it's a loose affiliation of tribes or something like that. And our evolution had to move in this direction of allowing humans to work together cooperatively in larger and larger groups to unlock larger and larger minds of human potential. But in order to do that, you have to trust people that you've never met before. And to trust people you've never met before, the idea of the tribe has to come in. The idea that, okay, I don't know this person, never met him before, but he's wearing the same clothing, or has the same sort of haircut, or in some way has identified himself through some marker as being a member of my tribe. And being a member of my tribe, there's a trust that's extended to that person that wouldn't be extended to someone who's not a member of my tribe. So one can readily imagine how this concept of tribal membership was a very natural and even necessary component of human evolution from the prehistoric era to today. And one can further, I think, imagine how at some point the idea of tribal affiliation, it becomes exhausted of its ability to improve human life. It fulfilled a function at some point in our distant or more recent past, but when humanity comes to occupy every corner of the inhabitable globe, and when bonds of economic and social and political bonds begin to unite everyone, and of course the fact that we all are breathing the same air and drinking the same water, and that what we do environmentally is affecting people on the other side of the globe. The idea of membership in a tribe that separates us from them at some point loses its status as a remedy. It loses its status as a social construction that is a useful one. So the first point I want to make as exercising our sociological imagination is allowing ourselves to step outside of the idea of nation, of membership in a particular nation, realize the arbitrariness of that, and allow ourselves to think about human identity in a larger context. Of course, comes naturally to Baha'is, since that's what we are. Our whole community is centered around, is this idea of the oneness of the human race. But I guess I wanted to dig in a little bit to the sociological foundations behind that, and what kind of a leap of imagination it requires from us to actively reimagine our identity in a way that transcends national borders. Very closely related to this, and it's the second point I wanted to bring out, is the idea of race. Race is very much one of those things which is either implicitly or explicitly taught to us from a very early age as something which is as real as trees and stones. But the more we look into the history of race and the construction of race worldwide, but particularly in the United States, we see just how much of a social construction it was. That one takes something very very non-essential like skin color and constructs oftentimes with very economic motives an overclass and an underclass, and enforces that in a way that brings to bear the entire machinery of society to enforce that social construction, for ultimately, in the beginning, for purposes of for economic purposes, for purposes of enriching a certain class of people. It's very interesting to look into the history of the construction of race in the United States, and I'm really a beginner in the subject, and so I don't feel like I'm a very eloquent, would be a very eloquent voice in describing it. But some of the materials I'm reading are so shocking and so mind expanding, really mind blowing. The idea of whiteness itself is a construction. The idea of who gets to be white is something which has changed over the years. I mean, it's easy to forget now, but it wasn't that many generations ago that if you were Jewish, you weren't considered white. If you were Irish or Italian, you weren't considered white. So there's this very sort of fluid definition of who gets to be included in this privileged class and who gets to be excluded. And so often it's on purely constructs of human imagination, oftentimes based upon greed and power that lead to them. This is again, I think, put very well in Revelation of Social Reality, and this is on page 9. It says at one point, it's a very lovely paragraph. It says, the slave was defined as less than human. The social structure was not reinforced by the casual beliefs of individuals alone. All of the systems of human knowing were brought to bear to justify the social order. Teachings of the Bible were invoked to affirm that the slave must obey the master and that beings of dark skin were inferior. To deny this was to deny the word of God. Sciences were utilized to justify the superiority of the white race. If any were to object, they could be dismissed as uninformed individuals, contending with empirical facts of the physical world. And how deep was the change in collective understanding after the bloody struggle in which the existing social order was overturned and slavery ended? Superficial at best. The constructed reality of slavery was legally abolished, only to be succeeded by Jim Crow laws and other forms of social oppression. The economic system of slavery was exchanged for de facto control through sharecropping. It would take another century for the civil rights movement to overthrow certain political and social inequalities. And even those substantial changes did not alter the underlying powerful substructures of social reality that supported white privilege. Institutionalized racism, for example, still leaves its mark on a significant number of African Americans through inferior educational options, oppressive social conditions, restricted opportunities to advance economically, and the demand to compromise a sense of self and culture to be white in order to advance. That brings out to me powerfully how a social construction once created, as it was in the case of slavery, can even be quote unquote abolished legally as it was over 100 years ago, but the construction remains. It's still there in our heads. It's still very much defining our social reality at present. But when we realize, as with our concept of nation and tribe, that this is entirely a social construction and has its roots as a kind of a human invention, that empowers us to re-envision our identity along these lines as well. The third one I want to mention, and this gets maybe a little bit more, well, maybe a little bit more abstract, is the idea of progress. Where are we going as a civilization? Where is humanity going? Are we ascending or are we descending? Are we advancing or are we regressing? It might be a question you might not have actively thought of before. It might have just been, well, it's a given that we're advancing. I mean, after all, Baha'u'llah says that we've all been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. And the idea of advance and progress is something which is very deeply embedded in the Western secular conception of history and of the world as well. The idea that every generation is going to push the boundaries of knowledge further than the generation before. I would say particularly since really the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, this idea of progress as being an inevitable and sort of ground truth of human reality is something which we often, I think, take for granted and don't question. And also doesn't, don't the Baha'i writings say that this is the day which will not be followed by night? Don't we have a sense of our own identity and in terms of what we are building and seeking to build in the world, that it's proceeding from a state of darkness to a state of light, that will remain forever, light. But what I want to challenge you with is the idea that this narrative of progress is something that we choose as well, because it all depends whether we're advancing on the whole or whether we are declining is a matter of at what level of perspective do we choose to look at things from. Just as an example, the ancient Greeks didn't believe in progress. The ancient Greeks thought that civilization was in a state of decline. The ancient Greeks already, let's say 500 BC, looked to the pyramids of Egypt, which by their time were already ancient, and they saw this remnant of this great civilization in the Nile Valley, and they came to the conclusion that we're in some descending arc of civilization, that the greatest pinnacle of human civilization must have been ancient Egypt. And so to the Greeks, they didn't have this sense that they're taking human society through their concept of democracy and through their concept of examination into the natural sciences and all the great things that the Greeks did. They didn't have this idea that we're progressing from a lower state to a higher state. And actually today, if you wanted to, you could bring science and the idea of entropy in to a defense of this view of the Greeks. Everything is running towards maximum entropy. Everything is running out of steam. The sun is eventually going to run out of its nuclear fuel, admittedly billions of years from now. So we don't have to worry about it on any time scale that is reasonable to the human species. But we know, nevertheless, that ultimately the sun is going to die and burn out, and every planet in the solar system is going to go cold and dark. And the same fate awaits the universe at large as entropy continues its inexorable trend towards maximizing disorder. And so where does that leave us in terms of whether we are advancing or whether we're declining? It's a narrative that we choose. We choose a narrative that we are on an ascending cycle, and maybe, as Abdu'l-Baha gives us, I suppose, a way of thinking about this in chapter 41 of Some Answered Questions. It's a chapter entitled Universal Cycles. It kind of blows up the whole narrative of infinite progress. Abdu'l-Baha says that there are great cycles in the world of being. At the end of one cycle, all trace of the previous cycle is erased and a new cycle begins. All memory of the last cycle is erased. Now one can think about this roughly on the scale of human civilizations, that there are catastrophic falls of civilization in which a great deal of knowledge and technology is lost that has to be reinvented, as was the case with parts of the ancient world. At the same time, on even larger time scales, we know that entire planets are born and die, and whatever civilizations might have been on them vanish without a trace. So we know that we know both from science, and if we believe Abdu'l-Baha's description of this sort of large-scale description of things in Some Answered Questions, we know that if anything, things are more cyclical than they are linear. And so then whether we are living in an age in which tomorrow will be a brighter day is a matter of what timescale we choose to look at. Yeah, if tomorrow is next century or next generation, then yes, we're still on this upward trending cycle. If tomorrow is 1 billion years from now, well, all bets are off. But my point in making this observation is that we choose a narrative that tends towards being a remedy. We choose a narrative that gives us a reason to be, that gives us a reason to work, a reason to give of ourselves and to participate in something larger than ourselves. And part of that narrative that is deeply embedded, not just in the Baha'i faith, but it's the narrative of science itself, is this narrative of progress. So taking these few ideas of sort of big picture ideas that we may have taken as unquestioned givens, and realizing that all of these are things that we choose, our nationality, race, the idea of of progress itself. If all of these things are things that we choose, then I guess my concluding thought is to ask, well, then what is truth? Are we saying that truth is just what we decide it is? Are we saying that truth is just is a choice rather than an uncovering of something more deeply embedded? And I want to suggest that that you can have your cake and eat it too in this. That just as in the case of the pragmatism of the scientific enterprise, where it's not that one is choosing one's facts, one chooses the scientific theories that end up having predictive power. There's a pragmatism embedded in the scientific enterprise that in which the models that one subscribes to are the models that work. And one makes the assumption that the models that work are likely to be aligned with reality. The model works because it ultimately matches with reality. That's kind of our definition of reality, I suppose, in the end. And it's the same thing, perhaps, with our concept of spirituality, our concept of what we're doing in the world as a spiritual community. We believe that we're aligned with reality. We believe that our teachings are reflective of some deeper layer of spiritual reality. But if someone were to challenge us and say, well, how do you know that? We can say either, well, it's a revelation from God, which would be an argument from authority, which only works if you already believe in it. Or you can say, we believe it's true because it's effective. We believe it's true because it works, because I've applied it in my own life and it's done this, because we have collectively applied these teachings and it has done this. It has produced this community of extraordinary diversity, which is tying together people across all reaches of the planet in a way that no community can do. That is a different kind of an argument than it's true because it was revealed. I don't want to say that one of these arguments is the right argument and one of these is the wrong argument. They're two aspects of the same thing. To say that it's true because it corresponds to reality, and to say it's true because it works is, just as in the scientific enterprise, really two sides of the same coin. But I suppose what I'm suggesting is that there's an issue of how we message our ideas and our ideals in the world, and it may depend on the audience that we're facing, and it may be that in one particular audience we can message our ideals in this language of it's a divine revelation and this is the message of God for the age. We can message the same set of ideals as Baha'u'llah does in the Tablet to Manashi Sahib, as this is a remedy for an illness. And we believe it's a remedy not because someone just told us it's a remedy. We believe it's a remedy because we are applying it. And in applying it, it is proven itself by creating individuals who are more spiritually fulfilled and happy, and by creating communities that are functioning and that include the full diversity of human beings on the planet. It also, I think, helps us approach this very difficult, sometimes question of infallibility. When one talks about the prophet and one says, well, the prophet is infallible. This lens through which we can see the nature of the remedy can help us with this idea. And actually, I got this idea also from Revelation of Social Reality, and this was a very nice spark that came on page 18. The idea is that the words of the prophet are true because his words define the basis of the new social reality that we're constructing. And in other words, their truth value is not attached to an argument from authority. Their truth value and why we consider them as unerring is attached to the fact that they're a proven remedy. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you with that thought as well. So that's about all I had planned for this, and I wanted to open this up for conversation. I don't know if this came across as challenging as I thought it did, but as I was going through these ideas, it seemed to me to be, I don't know, a kind of mind expanding and kind of, because it puts you in a sort of different framework of thinking, a framework which on the face of it might seem trivializing to say, well, it's true because it works. It almost, it almost seems like minimizing it. But what I wanted to do was suggest that there's something more profound at work behind those kinds of statements. So what do you all think?
I have a
Derek raised his hand. Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
I guess, you said there were 4, and I got nation, race, and progress, I guess.
Oh, the fourth one, I skipped the fourth one. But let me tell you what the fourth one was going to be. The fourth is to the extent that spiritual reality is constructed.
Oh.
Because given that all language is a social construction, so many of the words that we use, that we take as having this given set of meanings, are social constructions. God, soul, spirit, religion, revelation, the basic ideas that are kind of given to us, especially especially if we are born in a Judeo-Christian Islamic culture. The meanings of these words are things that are just sort of given to us. But to what extent are these words also sociologically constructed, and to what degree can we think outside the box in terms of what those words mean to us? And if we apply this principle of spiritual pragmatism to these core concepts, then I guess I didn't bring it up because it gets into very interesting territory. But part of the territory it gets into is to what extent is even the notion of God a social construction whose truth value, as with all of these other social constructions, is ultimately determined not by our ability to access ultimate reality and say, yes, this is true or this is not true, but rather its truth value is ultimately determined by whether the concept is an effective remedy in the world. In other words, does belief in God improve human life or not? The truth of the proposition that God exists then can be exchanged for, in some way, replaced with the equivalent proposition. Well, does it improve things? Does it help us in some way? Because ultimately, no one has access to that ground layer of reality to say whether it is or isn't. All we have is, what is the effect of the belief in this? What is the effect of the application of this idea in the world? That might lead the conversation a whole different direction. But
I guess I have a question of, and this may be oversimplifying the question or when I have the point, would you say the difference, like you were talking about how science looks at things and how sociological, wouldn't sort of the difference be that in science, it's true if it's considered true, it's true until it's proven not to be true. Whereas in sociological, there's a question of whether there's never a definitive that it's true. There's that.
I think part of the problem is how data is collected and interpreted. And one of the advantages of, let's say, astrophysics, speaking from what I have some knowledge of, one of the advantages is there's near universal consent on what the facts are. You know, there are big telescopes out there collecting the light, and everyone has access to the same ones and zeros that data gets translated into. Of course, the ones and zeros can be interpreted in a different way, but the methods that the physics community use tend towards, over time, convergence of opinions which may begin differently because they're interpreting the facts in a different way. That doesn't seem to be the case so much in the social sciences, particularly in sociology, because what are the facts, first of all? You can talk about rates of incarceration, you can talk about median incomes, you can talk about life expectancies, you can talk about all of these things, and although these also can be converted into numbers and discussed as though they were as fundamental as the masses of a proton or the charge of an electron, they're more malleable fundamentally, and they're more subject to interpretation. And so it's harder for a community to come to agreement, at least in part, because the nature of the data that they're working with is more subject to interpretation and bias in a fundamental level than the data of the hard sciences. That isn't to say that, well, it's useless then to try to apply a scientific mindset to sociology. It's where I was wanting to go with it is more the suggestion that what unites the physics enterprise, the enterprise of sociology, and the enterprise of the faith is that ultimately there are certain statements or models of reality that are presented, which ultimately should be judged based upon their efficacy in the world. If we try to judge them and sit around and argue whether it's true or not in a theoretical sense, and apply all the rational arguments that we can, and for every rational argument, at least in the spiritual domain, there's always a counter argument. You know, if you just dig a little bit into, say, the proofs for the existence of God, you find every traditional proof for the existence of God has a pretty good counterproof. And then there's a pretty good logical rebuttal to that counterproof, but then there's a pretty good logical rebuttal to the rebuttal. And it's ad infinitum. There's like, after thousands of years of playing this game of trying to prove something about the spiritual layer of reality, whether it be God or the soul or anything like that, no one can agree on what the fundamental facts of the matter are. There remains fundamental ambiguity as to whether the thing is or isn't. And that's where I think applying this principle of pragmatism, and in the spiritual domain, we call it spiritual pragmatism, I suppose, one sets aside those questions. Of course, it can't be logically inconsistent, but that still includes a whole lot of possible propositions. One ends up replacing one's litmus test for truth with a different sort of litmus test, which is really inspired by the physical sciences, and it's inspired by Baha'u'llah's own invocation of this analogy of the divine physician. You know, it's the strength and power and efficacy of the remedy that's the ultimate proof.
Yeah, I think too that thank you. You're wonderful. I don't know who you are, but you're just amazing. I think
I'm paying Catherine to say something nice about me. Thank you.
I think too what you were just touching on, that when the empirical data, for example, if sociology is collecting all of this data and it's finding particular truths, that I think what I'm sort of hearing you say is sort of like, it almost doesn't matter what the empirical data tells us. What is it that we need to do? What is required? What is it that's going to help us advance? Because at the end of the day, if that data, if an underabundance of data tells people, oh, well, we don't have enough data to support that, but that's the direction you should go. That's what you should do. You know, it's almost like the pragmatism required in any setting in which humans are involved is one of, what is the requirement for this soul, for these people to be elevated?
That is
What
a
is that?
fantastic
What would
and
that
wonderfully perceptive statement. Thank you for that. For anyone who doesn't know, Catherine is my wife. You should turn on your video, Catherine.
Yeah, I did, but it was, our internet's bad, so it was cutting me off. It was cutting you out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say, so your point is that the spiritual pragmatism and scientific and sociological pragmatism is kind of what makes the most sense and what works. Are you also saying that this is what the writings say as well? That this idea is supported in the writings?
I think it's supported. I can find support for it in the writings. I think one can cherry, of course, the writings are pretty vast, and one can cherry pick them to say a whole bunch of different things. I think with that caveat, I do think that Baha'u'llah's own description of himself as divine physician invites us to think in this sort of direction. And that's not the only place in the Baha'i writings where I find support for this kind of way of thinking. There's another example, and this is from the very recently translated mystical volume, Call of the Divine Beloved, and there's a newly translated tablet in there where Baha'u'llah says, basically a rough paraphrase, he says it's the nature of human existence that there's going to be different opinions on everything. And Baha'u'llah says this is a feature of the world, and there's no remedy for it. You know, people are always going to differ on everything. He says, therefore, and the solution that he gives is, therefore, one should be forgiving and overlook the shortcomings of others, and just love everybody. You know, the solution, it's like the solution is not there is a master set of ideas which is going to win the day. You know, Baha'u'llah never says that. He in so many places in his writings, he acknowledges that there are different schools of thought on this question. In a second tablet to Manashi Sahib, his Zoroastrian friend asks him about different theories of creation. And he says, which of these is right? And he basically gives, you know, theism, atheism, deism, and pantheism as 4 different options, and asks Baha'u'llah, which of these is right? And you would think Baha'u'llah, as the prophet for the day, would say, well, it's theism, because, you know, most of his revelation is written through that lens and with the language of theism. But Baha'u'llah doesn't do that. He says one can provide a justification for each of these schools of thought. So when it comes to there being different ways of looking at things, Baha'u'llah almost seems careful to avoid reducing the options and saying there's only one correct way of thinking about it. And that connects to me, in my mind, that connects to this idea of spiritual pragmatism. You know, that ultimately one goes with what works, because we don't have access to ultimate reality, and we will never have access to ultimate reality. It's never going to be a plausible route for us collectively to ever at any point sit in a room and say, oh, let's talk it through. This is correct, and the others are not correct. The best we're ever going to be able to do is say, well, we're going to vote, and the majority says we're going to do this for now until the evidence tells us otherwise. And those who didn't vote are going to say, okay, I still disagree, but for the sake of moving forward in unity, I'm going to go with that. You know, the basic model of Baha'i consultation, I think, seems built around this ultimate fact of human social reality, which is that opinions will continue to differ. It's better if we act in perfect unity, and the writings exhort us over and over to come into a state of perfect unity. But I think Baha'u'llah is pragmatic enough to realize that that's simply not a guarantee. And in so many cases, it's not going to be the case that we have perfect unity about things. But we have a solution, and it's the pragmatic solution of picking the route that produces the best results. And that at least has a better chance of being a source of objective truth that we can rally around.
I feel like these ideas are relieving. As a human, it's relieving to have this way to think about things. I wonder if as a scientist, there's any aspect of it that is demotivating.
That's a great question, because I don't think so, because of course, at least as far as theoretical physics is concerned, there has very long been a dream that there is a final theory out there. At some point it's going to be discovered, and that final theory is going to be expressible in one beautiful equation. And when that happens, everyone is going to say, wow, the equation has been found, and it unites all the branches of science, and gravity and quantum mechanics are now married together and live happily ever after, and all of that. And that's the dream, but the reality is a lot messier. I mean, and maybe it is, maybe it will be the case that that final equation will be found. But that doesn't stop the advance of the scientific project. It doesn't stop people from being excited about new discoveries, from standing in awe at the beauty and symmetry and underlying order of the universe, even if the models they're creating, they know are inadequate in some way. You know, people who are studying quantum mechanics know that it doesn't quite include gravity at this point, but you can still go a long distance and do some really exciting stuff just using the framework of quantum mechanics. And likewise for those who are studying general relativity and things at a cosmological level. It doesn't it doesn't totally deflate the scientific enterprise. It does deflate a particular, let's say, maximalist view of the scientific enterprise that wants it to swallow up everything else in one uber theory. But I think more, and that was, I think, more fashionable in the middle part of the last century. And I think it's a little less fashionable these days in the scientific community to think in those terms.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I saw an interview with a quantum physicist, and he was saying that, at least as I understood what he was saying, was that if you strip away this anthropomorphical concept of God and just accept, if you accept God as that which always was, always is, and is responsible for everything, then quantum physics is ultimately going to prove that.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. Well, I think Baha'u'llah says something which I think is fundamentally in agreement with that, and it's in his Tablet of Wisdom, Lohe Hekmat. It's in Tablets of Baha'u'llah. And in that tablet, Baha'u'llah draws an astounding parallel or identity equation between two things which people for centuries had thought were two completely different things. Baha'u'llah says nature is the primal will, God's will, operating in and through the contingent world. He equates these, and for centuries, you had a group of people saying God's will is the ultimate cause of everything. It causes every leaf to fall from the tree. Every single thing can be attributed to God's will. And then you had, on the other hand, the scientists saying, no, it's the laws of nature. It's electromagnetism, dummy. It's gravity, it's strong and weak nuclear forces, and we have the equations, and look, we can make all these predictions with it. So no, it's not God's will. That's a bunch of superstitious nonsense. And Baha'u'llah in the Tablet of Wisdom says, no, they're the same thing. Abdu'l-Baha had a conversation with Henri Bergson, the famous French philosopher, in 1913 in Paris, which had exactly the same. The upshot of the conversation was exactly the same as Baha'u'llah's statement in the Tablet of Wisdom, and it basically just out the gate, Abdu'l-Baha says, look, what you philosophers have been talking about as nature, and what the divine philosophers, the theologians, have been talking about as God's will, has always been the same thing. It's just that you're thinking about it in different ways. You're seeing it through a different lens. He doesn't use that phrase, but that's basically what he says. He says, but ultimately it's the same thing. That's kind of, that's I find that really relieving too, because it moves, because monism is just a lot more relaxing than dualism. I mean, a dualistic way of thinking, it has a sort of tension embedded in it. There's these kinds of things and those kinds of things. And there's always this question, well, how do these two kinds of things relate? Is one on top of the other like this, or is it like this, or is it like this? And you can only see one of them, you can't see the other. And so you're always inferring something about the spiritual on the basis of what you see from and that was the whole project of Descartes in the 1600s, was metaphysical dualism. And I see a lot of that still in Baha'i thinking. I mean, which is, it's everywhere. I mean, it's not just, Baha'is aren't the only ones, obviously, still stuck in dualistic modes of thinking, but the whole Western world is implicitly or explicitly thinking very dualistically about these questions. I see in the Baha'i writings ways of thinking that transcend dualism. I see these most strongly in the Hidden Words and in the Seven Valleys and other mystical works of Baha'u'llah, and scattered in a few places in writings of Abdu'l-Baha as well. And these monistic ways of thinking are more, I guess I'm using the word relaxing, I guess a little tongue-in-cheek, but they resolve all sorts of tensions. When you think about spiritual material not as two kinds of substances, but as really just two ways of describing one underlying layer of reality, all kinds of cognitive dissonance goes away. Abdu'l-Baha is very explicit about this in one of his talks in Persian, and he kind of does away with metaphysical dualism in one sentence. He says, to the vegetable, the animal is the spirit. So that's kind of, that's enough for a whole, that's a foundation stone for a whole different way of thinking about the world, which sees spirit, what you might call spirit, or what you might call forces of nature, depending on your perspective, as existing in a kind of ladder. There's a verticality to existence where you have simple things at the bottom and complex things at the top. And the simple things manifest certain attributes. Minerals manifest the attribute of cohesion. They also manifest the attributes of gravity, of attraction to, say, the center of the earth when you drop a rock. There's a limited number of things that rocks manifest. Plants manifest all sorts of other things, even though they're built on the same substrate. It's a higher degree of spirit, as Abdu'l-Baha calls it. But they exhibit the power of growth and reproduction. They reach towards the sun. That's a profoundly spiritual thing to the plant. That's the plant's way of being spiritual, is by growing. And all the way up the ladder until the ladder of complexity, if you're looking at the physical world, or the ladder of spiritual potentiality, if you're looking at it through a spiritual lens. At each higher degree in creation, higher and higher degrees of spiritual potentialities become manifest. All of these potentialities can be summed up in different ways. One way to sum it up is the idea of consciousness, that the universe is in a continual process of becoming conscious. And this transcends this divide, the dichotomous duality between material and spiritual. Material things are conscious in a sort of lower level sense, in that they're connected to everything in this web of cause-effect relationships. In that sense, everything is aware of everything else. Awareness in that lower sense. But at higher and higher degrees of consciousness, one of the highest degrees of consciousness, at least on this planet, is self-consciousness. And so beautifully expressed in the hidden words. Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee. And in reaching that peak, that degree of self-awareness, of true self-awareness, one realizes that one is completing a circle by turning back and recognizing the divine light within. One is completing in microcosmic form the macrocosmic movement of the universe, which is expressed again in the hidden words, that I loved thy creation, therefore I created thee. Wherefore do thou love me, that I may name thy name and fill thy soul with the spirit of life. Everything is created to become conscious of the reality which lies within, which is the same as being conscious of God. One can state it in dualistic terms, man and God, and God created man so that man could love God. One can also express the same idea in the monistic terms of the circle of creation, which is in Some Answer Questions and various places in the writings, in which it's the self coming to a true knowledge of its own self. Now there's no me and there's no I and thou in that formulation. The thou that the I recognizes becomes the same as the I. The same idea in the Seven Valleys. Baha'u'llah patterns the Seven Valleys after this beautiful story of the Conference of the Birds and the journey of the birds. 30 birds traversing different valleys, search, knowledge, unity, and so forth, on their way to discovering ultimate reality. And in Persian, it's all lost in English, but in Persian, 30 birds is si morg. Si is 30 and morg is birds. And the birds are on a journey to discover this great bird who's going to tell them the nature of reality. And this great bird's name is si morg, 30 birds. So the birds are on a journey to discover themselves. I mean, it's there from the very beginning of the original story of the Seven Valleys is a story ultimately and a journey of self-discovery. And it transcends the kind of the separateness of things. It resolves the tension between the this and the that, without negating it. I mean, the this and the that is still in some context a useful framework. Thinking dualistically can be a useful way of navigating the world. For one thing, it makes morality a lot clearer to define. What's right and wrong, it's a lot easier if you can draw a line and say this is right and that is wrong. There's a pragmatism to doing that. There's a usefulness to doing it. So that's why we have laws in the Kitabi Akdas. That's why societies have laws. Yes, it's a useful approximation, ultimately to be determined and judged by to what extent it's a remedy, to what extent it leads to the fuller efflorescence of human life and a further unlocking of human potential. That's ultimately the thing that we judge it on the basis of.
Yeah.
So our hour is long gone.
Yeah, Stephen, I just wanted to say it was so beautifully put, and I think that the social principles are the remedy. They are what allow us and everyone the opportunity to get to know ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It elevates everyone so we can recognize ourselves and all of us around us.
Thank you for that beautiful and profound comment.
You're welcome.
All right, so why don't we tie it off here? I mean, there's so many Zoom calls and things. You can only take in so many in one day.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and listening. I suppose this is going to be posted somewhere, but thanks a lot.
Thank you, and I hope this is, because I think I told you this once before. I have to watch your videos, and I have to watch you on video so I can like stop it and go back and say, I have to, every time you talk, you make my head explode.
Thanks. I'll take that as a compliment.
Oh,
Yeah.
it is. It is.
I'm lucky I still have one.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate you.
Look forward to seeing you all next summer.
All right.
All right.